The night smelled like expensive whiskey and fresh sin. Kwon Jae-sung stepped through the double doors of Mistress Yuna's villa in Songbuk-dong like a man who owned the city, because he did. His black suit was Italian. His watch cost more than most men earned in 5 years. 2 bodyguards flanked him like shadows, their faces carved from stone. The villa was all glass and golden light, draped in silk curtains that fluttered like secrets about to spill. Jae-sung didn't knock. Men like him never knocked. He simply arrived, and the world rearranged itself around him. He was the head of the Kwon Syndicate, Seoul's most feared crime family, and tonight, after 3 brutal weeks of territory negotiations in Busan, he had come for rest. For warm arms and cold wine. For the one place where he didn't have to be a king. He handed his jacket to a houseboy without looking at him and called out for Yuna. Her voice floated down the spiral staircase like perfume, sweet, practiced, expensive. She appeared at the top landing in a red silk robe, her laughter already rehearsed, her smile already performing. Jae-sung felt something in his chest soften despite himself. This was the arrangement. No love. No complications. Just comfort. He moved toward the sitting room, where dinner had been laid out, 3 courses, candles already burning low. But the kitchen door was still swinging. Someone had just passed through it. A servant. Carrying a tray of sliced persimmons, her back to him, her head bowed. She wore a plain gray uniform. The fabric was rough. Her shoulders were thin but steady. Jae-sung glanced at her the way powerful men glance at invisible people, barely, briefly, already forgetting. Then she turned around. Time didn't slow. It stopped. The tray tilted in her hands. One slice of persimmon slid off and landed on the polished marble floor with a soft, wet sound that seemed to echo through the entire universe. Her eyes met his. Dark brown. Wide. Terrified. Proud. She caught herself before the tray fell completely. Her jaw locked. Her chin lifted. She didn't run. She didn't scream. She simply stood there, holding that silver tray like a shield, staring at the man who had once placed a diamond ring on her finger in front of 400 guests in Lagos. The man who had once whispered that she was the only home he had ever known. The man who had signed divorce papers 3 years ago without reading them. Her name was Adaeze Obikwon. And she was supposed to be gone. She was supposed to be a memory. She was supposed to be someone else's problem now. Jae-sung felt his lungs forget what air was. He had seen her face 10,000 times in dreams he refused to admit having. But this was real. The smell of the kitchen on her uniform. The slight tremble in her hands that she was fighting to control. The way she looked at him, not with love, not with hate, but with something colder and more devastating than both. Recognition. Distance. A wall she had clearly spent years building and wasn't about to let crumble in Yuna's dining room. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Behind him, Yuna was already descending the stairs, already sensing the temperature in the room had changed, already calculating. But Jae-sung couldn't move. He was a man who had faced armed rivals, government investigations, and contract betrayals without flinching. And a woman in a gray maid's uniform had turned him to stone in 4 seconds flat. Adaeze. The word came out cracked. Barely a whisper. More breath than sound. She blinked once, slow, deliberate, controlled, and gave a tiny bow, the kind a servant gives an employer's guest. Formal. Hollow. Professionally distant. "Good evening, sir," she said. Her voice was steady. How was her voice steady? His hands were shaking inside his pockets and she sounded like stone. She turned back toward the kitchen. 3 steps. 4. The door swung behind her. And Jae-sung stood in the middle of Yuna's beautiful, golden, meaningless villa, feeling like a man who had just realized the earthquake had already happened, he just hadn't felt the ground move yet. Somewhere deeper in the house, behind a closed door down the eastern hallway, he heard something that made his blood stop completely. Not one sound. Three. Three small voices. Laughing. Children. Three children. Laughing in a language that mixed Igbo and Korean like a song he had never heard but somehow already knew. 3 years earlier, the world had been different. Jae-sung wasn't supposed to marry Adaeze Obi. That was the first thing his mother told him when he arrived in Lagos for the Kwan Syndicate's West African expansion meetings. The second thing she told him was that feelings were a liability. He had ignored both pieces of advice within 72 hours of landing at Murtala Muhammad International Airport. Lagos hit him like nothing Seoul had prepared him for. The heat was alive, the noise was layered, the colors were aggressive and joyful and unapologetic. He had stepped out of an air-conditioned SUV on Victoria Island and heard music tumbling out of a building like laughter, and inside that building, at a business dinner that was supposed to be about trade routes and not human beings, he had seen her. Adaeze Obi. 28 years old. Daughter of Chief Emeka Obi, one of Nigeria's most formidable import-export brokers. She sat across the table in a gold-threaded Ankara dress, arguing economics with 3 older men who clearly underestimated her, and winning. She hadn't smiled at Jae-sung once the entire evening. That was what did it. He had pursued her for 4 months before she agreed to coffee. She made him earn every step. She asked him hard questions, about his business, about his values, about what kind of man he was when no one was watching. He gave her honest answers, which surprised him because he hadn't been honest with anyone in years. She laughed at his stiff Korean formality. He was undone by her directness. They moved between Lagos and Seoul for a year, building something neither of them had a name for, until Jae-sung stood in front of her father's compound in Enugu with a bride price list he had researched for 3 weeks and a heart he didn't know he still possessed. Chief Obi had looked at him for a long time, this Korean crime lord in a tailored suit trying to perform tradition he hadn't grown up with, and then the old man had nodded. Not because of the money. Because Jae-sung had looked at Adaeze the whole time, not at him. That was the answer. The wedding was in Lagos. 400 guests. 2 cultures colliding like music. Adaeze wore white and gold. Jae-sung wept during the vows, which no one who worked for him would ever be allowed to mention again. For 2 years, they lived between worlds. A penthouse in Gangnam. A family home in Lekki. Adaeze learned enough Korean to argue with his mother, which she did, often, and fearlessly. Jae-sung learned enough Igbo to whisper endearments that made Adaeze cover her face and laugh into her hands. They were imperfect and combustible and completely, dangerously real. But the syndicate never stopped. The meetings ran late. The calls came at midnight. Bodies occasionally appeared in news reports connected to territories Jae-sung controlled, and Adaeze began asking questions he couldn't answer honestly without destroying everything they had built. She wasn't naive, she had always known the outline of his world. But outlines are different from details. And details, when they finally arrive, have weight. She started keeping a journal. She started making plans. She was not the kind of woman who waited for disaster, she was the kind who prepared for it quietly, methodically, without anyone noticing. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. Adaeze was 6 months pregnant. They hadn't known yet it was triplets, the third heartbeat hidden behind the other 2, shy and small. She had found a folder on Jae-sung's laptop. Not by snooping, the screen had been open, left carelessly unlocked on the kitchen counter like a trap that set itself. Inside the folder, a property in Jeju. A second phone number registered under a shell company. Photographs of Yuna, not old photographs. Recent ones. Time stamped from the previous month, while Jae-sung had been in Busan, supposedly alone, negotiating port contracts. Adaeze closed the laptop. She sat at the kitchen counter for 40 minutes. She didn't cry. She made a list. Then she called her father. Her voice, Chief Obi would later tell her brothers, was the quietest and most frightening he had ever heard her sound. Like water just before it boils. Jae-sung came home that night to a half-empty apartment. No note. No screaming. Just absence, which hit harder than either. Her clothes were gone. Her books. The small Yoruba prayer cloth she kept folded on the nightstand. He called her 17 times. She answered the 18th. Her voice was calm, clear, and final. She told him she would not raise children inside his world. She told him she wanted no settlement, no negotiation, no dramatic confrontation. She told him the lawyers would handle everything. Then she said one more thing, quiet, direct, devastating, that she had loved him completely and that it had not been enough. She hung up. He stood in the empty bedroom smelling her absence and understood, for the first time in his life, what it felt like to lose something you could never buy back. The divorce was finalized 4 months later. He signed without reading. He told himself it was cleaner that way. He told himself that lie every day for 3 years. And now she was carrying persimmons in his mistress's house, and somewhere behind a closed door, 3 children were laughing in the language of everything he had thrown away. Adaeze did not sleep that night. She lay in the narrow bed in the servants' quarters at the back of Yuna's villa, a room barely large enough for a single mattress and a wooden dresser, and stared at the ceiling while the villa settled around her with its nighttime sounds. The air smelled faintly of garlic and cleaning solution. Through the thin wall, she could hear the triplets breathing. She had learned, over 3 years, to find peace in that sound. Zara, the eldest by 4 minutes, breathed with small determined puffs, like even in sleep she was making decisions. Kemi breathed slow and musical, her tiny chest rising and falling like a gentle tide. And Taeyang, the hidden one, the surprise, the third heartbeat, breathed in long, quiet sighs, as if sleeping were something he took very seriously. 3 years old. Black and Korean and entirely, heartbreakingly beautiful. Her whole reason. Her entire architecture. The structure around which she had rebuilt every piece of herself that had crumbled. She had not planned to be here, not in this villa, not in this particular corner of her life. She had returned to Seoul 8 months ago from Lagos, where she had spent most of her post-divorce years wrapped in her family's protection, working remotely for a Nairobi-based NGO, raising the triplets in the Obi compound under her father's roof. But Chief Obi had fallen ill, his heart, which had always seemed indestructible, quietly negotiating its limits, and the medical bills had begun reshaping the family's finances with ruthless efficiency. Adaeze had made her calculations the way she made all her calculations, privately, thoroughly, and without complaint. She had assets. She had a degree in international development from Yonsei University. She had contacts in Seoul. What she hadn't had was time to be proud. So she had come back. Had taken the first position that paid well enough and asked few enough questions. Yuna's household manager, Mrs. Cho, had hired her without knowing who she was. Adaeze had kept it that way. She was good at being unseen when she chose to be. But she had not chosen to be seen tonight. She had been meticulous, she had checked Yuna's guest schedule every week, had known the villa's rhythms, had arranged herself around them like water around stone. What she had not accounted for was Jae-sung arriving unannounced, which apparently he did when the mood struck him, because men like Jae-sung considered schedules to be other people's problems. She pressed her fingers to her temples in the dark. She had looked at him. That was the mistake. She should have kept her eyes down. She should have been less herself, but 3 years of surviving alone had burned away whatever softness had once allowed her to make herself small. She had looked at him directly, and his face had done what she had spent years preparing for it not to do. It had cracked. Just slightly. Just enough. And something inside her chest had responded before she could stop it, not love, not anymore, but the memory of love, which was arguably worse. Because the memory knew exactly what to miss. By morning, she had made her decision. She would leave the villa. She would find another position, there were always positions for quiet, capable women who asked no questions. She would be gone before Jae-sung could ask anything or offer anything or look at her again with those eyes that had once made her feel like the most important geography in the world. She began composing the resignation letter in her head, choosing words that were professional and left no opening. But then Zara knocked on her door, small knuckles, 3 rapid taps, the triplets code, and pushed it open in her pink pajamas, her black curls tangled from sleep, her eyes wide with the uncomplicated urgency of a 3-year-old who had woken up hungry. Zara said, using the Korean word for mother with the comfort of a child who has never known a world without it. Taeyong bit Kemi. Behind her, the sound of crying. Behind that, Taeyong's defensive wailing. Adaeze closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then she got up. She made jollof rice for breakfast because it was fast and the children loved it and she needed something to do with her hands. The small kitchen adjacent to the servants' quarters was hers alone. Mrs. Cho had arranged it that way, understanding without being told that Adaeze's situation was delicate. The smell of tomatoes and palm oil and Scotch bonnet filled the room like something ancient and anchoring. Kemi had forgiven Taeyong by the time the food was ready. 3-year-olds have short memories and shorter grudges. The triplets sat around the low table, their faces round and earnest, their skin a warm brown that carried both their parents' worlds in its depth. Zara ate methodically, like her father. Kemi narrated her eating to no one in particular, like Adaeze's Lagos aunties. Taeyong rearranged his rice into shapes before consuming it, which was entirely his own invention. Adaeze watched them and felt the familiar compression in her chest, love and terror and ferocious protectiveness pressing together until they were indistinguishable from each other. Then there was a knock at the servants' entrance door. Firm. Deliberate. Familiar. Not Mrs. Cho's knock. Not the houseboy's. Her hand froze on the spoon. She knew that knock. She had opened doors for it for 2 years. Jae-sung had not slept. He had dismissed Yuna's attempts at conversation with 2 words and sat in the villa's study until 4 a.m. staring at a glass of whiskey he never drank. By dawn he was standing outside the servants' quarters with his tie loosened and his eyes carrying the particular exhaustion of a man battling himself. He hadn't told his bodyguards where he was going. He had simply walked. Down the long east corridor, past the rooms that Yuna used for storage and the room where Mrs. Cho kept household accounts, toward the back of the villa where the smell of cooking had begun drifting through the air like a signal. Jollof rice. He knew that smell. He had woken up to it 100 times in a Lekki kitchen while Lagos traffic began its daily argument outside the window. His body had moved toward it before his mind finished deciding whether to. He stood at the door for 30 seconds before knocking. He used the rhythm he always had, firm, twice, then once. He didn't know why. Some things lived in muscle memory longer than in conscious thought. Silence. Then movement. Then the door opened, not all the way. Adaeze filled the gap with her body, her hands still on the frame, her face arranged into professional neutrality that cost her something. She had changed from her uniform into a wrapper of deep burgundy and gold. Her hair was tied. Behind her, something scrambled, small feet, the squeak of a chair. She pulled the door slightly more closed behind her. "Mr. Kwon," she said. The formality was a declaration. An entire wall in 2 words. Jae-sung looked at her, really looked, the way he had stopped himself from doing in the dining room because doing it there would have been falling off a cliff in public. She was thinner than he remembered. There were lines at the corners of her eyes that hadn't been there before. And something in her bearing that was different, harder, denser, like iron that had been tested and decided to remain iron. She was more beautiful than he had allowed himself to remember, which was its own particular punishment. "I need to talk to you," he said. "I have nothing to say," she answered. "Then listen." She was quiet for a beat. "You have 5 minutes." He didn't know where to start. He was a man who gave orders with 5 syllables or fewer, a man whose silence was more powerful than most people's speeches, and standing in front of this woman he had lost, he felt inarticulate in a way that had no business living inside a man of his reputation. He started with the wrong thing. He said he hadn't known she was here. She said that was the point. He said he needed to understand. She asked understand what, exactly, his schedule that had him arriving at his mistress's home unannounced, or the 3 years of her life that were none of his business anymore. He felt the words hit. He deserved them. He stood still and received them. Then, from inside the room, muffled but unmistakable, a small voice said something in Korean. A question. And another voice answered it in Yoruba. And a third voice laughed at something only itself found funny. 3 voices. 3 distinct personalities. He felt his chest collapse inward like a building that had lost its main support. Adaeze, he said. Very quietly. His voice was different now. Not the boss. Not the man with power. Just, a man. How old are they? She looked at him for a long time. And he watched something move behind her eyes, a decision being made, weighed, turned over. She was calculating risk the way she always had, not from fear, but from intelligence. She had always been the smarter one. He had always known that, even when it inconvenienced him. 3, she said finally. 3. The word landed like a stone dropped from a great height, the splash small, the depth enormous. He did the arithmetic. She watched him do it. She watched his face change as the numbers arranged themselves into meaning. He hadn't known. Or he had refused to know. She had never told him. The divorce was finalized before she was even showing. She had made that calculation too, that a man in his world knowing about 3 children was not safety. It was leverage. It was exposure. It was 3 small lives becoming complications in an empire that dealt with complications in ways she refused to let near her children. He understood all of that in the space of 5 seconds. And it broke something open in him that he didn't have a name for. 3, he repeated, to himself more than to her. She stepped back. Your 5 minutes are up. She closed the door. Not slammed, closed, carefully, deliberately, with exactly as much force as was necessary and no more. He stood outside it for a long time. The smell of jollof rice was still in the air. Inside, he heard her voice, low, warm, completely transformed from the controlled instrument she used with him, speaking to the children. A laugh. A gentle scold. The sound of small spoons on small bowls. Jae-sung put his hand flat against the door, just for a second, and then pulled it away and walked back down the corridor with the posture of a man who has just discovered that the war he thought he had won was the one he had already lost. His phone was buzzing. His lieutenants needed answers. 3 shipments. A territory dispute in Incheon. The kind of problems that, an hour ago, had been the only things that existed. He silenced the phone and kept walking. But his mind had stayed behind, pressed against that door, listening to 3 children eat breakfast in the language of everything that mattered. He had one thought, cycling clean and continuous through the machinery of his mind. He was not leaving this villa. Not yet. Not until he knew everything. Yuna Park had not built her life on ignorance. She had built it on observation, on the careful, continuous reading of powerful men, their moods, their weaknesses, their tells. She had learned early that men with money and influence were, at their cores, simple creatures with complex defenses. You learned what they ran from, and you made sure you were the opposite of that thing. With Jae-sung, what he ran from was softness. Real softness, the kind that asked things of him, the kind that stayed. So Yuna had made herself beautiful and entertaining and emotionally uncomplicated, and it had worked for 2 years. Until last night, when everything in the villa had shifted like furniture in an earthquake, and she had stood at the top of her staircase watching Kwon Jae-sung look at a woman in a gray maid's uniform like she was the only solid thing left in the world. Yuna was not stupid. She recognized that look. She had never received it. That was information. She spent the morning performing normalcy, calling her stylist, reviewing villa accounts with Mrs. Cho, ordering lunch from the restaurant in Insadong that Jae-sung preferred. All the while, she was conducting a parallel investigation through the villa's small social ecosystem. Mrs. Cho, when carefully questioned over morning tea, revealed that the new maid, Adaeze, had arrived 8 months ago, highly recommended, private, efficient, kept her children in the back quarters, no trouble at all. Yuna's hand paused on her teacup. Children. How many? She asked, casually. Mrs. Cho smiled with the fond obliviousness of someone who genuinely liked children. 3. Triplets. Adorable little things. She calls them her world. Yuna set the teacup down very gently. 3. She thought about Jae-sung's face last night. The stillness. The cracked open quality of his eyes. And now she thought about 3 children in the back of her house, and a woman who had looked at her arrangement with Jae-sung as if it were a footnote to a story she had already finished reading. She went looking for Jae-sung at noon and found him where she hadn't expected, not in the study, not on the terrace. In the garden. The villa's back garden, which opened from the eastern side, was a modest square of manicured grass and persimmon trees, irony she didn't have the bandwidth to appreciate right now. He was standing near the garden wall with his jacket off, his sleeves rolled up, watching something. Yuna followed his gaze and felt her carefully maintained interior landscape shift tectonic. 3 small children were chasing each other between the persimmon trees. The girl in the pink dress was leading the game with absolute authority. The quieter girl was collecting fallen leaves with scientific focus. The boy was attempting to climb a tree that was clearly winning the argument. And seated on a bench near the wall, watching them with the specific vigilance of a woman whose love is also a security system, was Adaeze. She hadn't noticed Jae-sung yet. He hadn't moved. He was looking at those children the way men look at things they are realizing, for the first time, belong to them. Yuna stood in the doorway for a long moment. She was a woman who prided herself on never making scenes. Scenes were for women who had nothing else to leverage. But standing there watching Jae-sung watch those children, she felt something she was not accustomed to feeling. Not jealousy, exactly. Something closer to grief. She had spent 2 years learning the specific geography of Kwon Jae-sung, what made him cold, what made him briefly warm, how to navigate the spaces between. And she understood now, watching him watch that small boy fall out of the tree's lower branches and scramble up immediately without crying, that she had never once seen his face look like that. Open. Unguarded. Completely without armor. He didn't even know she was behind him. He existed, in that moment, entirely in a world she was not part of. She stepped back inside. She closed the door quietly. Then she sat at her kitchen island and began making different calculations, not about how to compete, but about how much she stood to lose, and who, specifically, was going to try to make her lose it faster. She picked up her phone. She called a number she kept for situations that required a different kind of attention. The call was answered in one ring. I need information, she said, on a woman named Adaeze Obi-kwan. Everything. That evening, Jae-sung informed Yuna he would be staying at the villa for the rest of the week. He said it without explanation, which was his way, but his eyes when he said it were somewhere else entirely. Yuna smiled with every resource she had and said of course, she would have his room prepared. She said it warmly. She said it without even a tremor of the ice that had formed in her chest. She was a practical woman. She knew that the battle, whatever shape it was taking, had not yet fully declared its terms. She needed information before she chose her weapon. She also needed Adaeze out of this villa, but forcing the issue directly was the kind of move that left evidence and invited consequences. No. There were cleaner ways to remove a problem. She had learned that from the most powerful man she knew. The man currently standing in her garden, watching his hidden children play in the last light of a Seoul evening, wearing the face of a man who had just discovered he had a reason to live. Yuna would not let that reason destroy her. She had worked too hard. Come too far. Given too much. She topped up her wine and smiled at nothing, beautifully, the way she had been trained to smile. Then she opened the information her contact had already begun sending. And she started to read. Taeyong Kwanobi, who did not yet know his full name, who knew only that his name was Taeyong and that his mother called him her star, had noticed the tall man. He noticed most things. His sister said he was the quiet one, which wasn't quite accurate. He simply stored information before spending it. He had first seen the tall man 2 days ago in the garden, standing very still near the wall with his sleeves rolled up, watching them with an expression Taeyong did not yet have language for. It wasn't the way the houseboy watched them, bored and tolerant. It wasn't the way Mrs. Cho watched them, fond and hurried. It was something else. Something that made Taeyong's chest feel strange, like when Amma played the old Yoruba lullabies on her phone and her eyes went somewhere he couldn't follow. He had told Zara, because Zara was the one you told things to. Zara had looked at the tall man with her arms crossed, assessing, the way she assessed everything. He keeps watching Amma too, she reported. This was true. Taeyong had noticed that also. Kemi, who loved everyone indiscriminately and with enormous enthusiasm, had already tried to speak to the tall man. She had walked up to him in the garden on the second morning while Adaeze was hanging laundry on the back line, and had said in her mixture of Yoruba and Korean that he had nice shoes. The man had looked down at her with an expression that folded his face in a way that made him look, briefly, like someone who was hurting. He had crouched down to her level, which grown-ups rarely did, and said in Korean, clear, quiet, that she had a very beautiful name. Kemi had told him her full name, Oyawakami Adaeze Kwanobi. She said it perfectly, the way Amma had taught them, both the Yoruba and Korean parts, like a song that belonged to 2 countries at once. The man's face had done something she didn't have words for. Then Adaeze had appeared with the laundry basket and said, sharply and quietly, Kemi. Come. Kemi had come. But she told her siblings the tall man had sad eyes, and that she liked him. Adaeze had seen it all. She had stood behind the laundry line with her hands full of damp cloth and watched Kemi, fearless, boundless Kemi, walk straight up to Kwon Jae-sung and speak to him as if he were just another person in the garden. And she had watched Jae-sung crouch down. And she had felt the terror move through her clean and cold, the way terror always moves when the thing you have most feared finally stops being hypothetical. She had called Kemi away and spent the rest of the afternoon processing the reality that this situation had officially collapsed past the point of management. He was not leaving. She had watched his car, still in the drive. His bodyguards, still in the gatehouse. His presence in the villa, constant, quiet, deliberate. He was staying. And he was making no demands. No confrontations. No scenes. That was the part that frightened her most. She understood aggressive men, she had grown up watching her father's rivals. What she had less practice with was patient ones. And Jae-sung, she had always known, was dangerous precisely because he could be both. That night, she sat the triplets down for their evening story and found she couldn't concentrate on the words. Zara noticed first. She always did. Amma, she said, putting a small hand on Adaeze's knee with the gravity of a much older person. Are you scared? Adaeze looked at her daughter, this child who had come out of her leading the way, who had never once asked permission to take up space, and thought, what do you tell a 3-year-old about the weight of choices you made before she was born? What do you say about love and danger and the impossible calculus of protecting someone by keeping them secret? You say nothing. You pull her close, and her sister, and her brother, all 3 of them warm and heavy against you, smelling of soap and sleep, and you read the story in a steady voice until their eyes close, one by one. Zara last, as always, her eyes fighting sleep like it is a negotiation she intends to win. When they were all breathing slow and even, Adaeze sat in the dark for a long time. Then she made a decision she had been postponing for 3 years. Tomorrow, she would speak to him first. On her terms. before he could choose the ground. She found him on the villa's rear terrace at dawn, coffee in hand, Seoul's skyline turning gold and pink behind him. He heard her coming and turned. She had worn her own clothes, not the uniform. A deep green dress her mother had sent from Lagos, familiar and self-possessed. She stood on the opposite side of the terrace table and looked at him across it like it was a boardroom. He waited. She had always appreciated that he knew when to wait. "I'm going to say this once," she said, her voice low and controlled, "and you are going to listen completely before you speak." He nodded. So she told him. Not everything, not yet. But the architecture of it. That she had known she was pregnant before the divorce was finalized. That she had chosen not to tell him. That the choice had been made not from cruelty but from survival, from the understanding that Kwon Jae-sung's world was one she could survive, but that 3 infants could not. She told him she had never regretted keeping them. She told him she had regretted, every single day, the pieces of the decision that still kept her awake at 3 a.m. She told him their names. All 3, formally, with their full names, both parts. She watched his face receive each one like a blow he held himself still for. It was Yuna who detonated it. Jae-sung would think about this later, would trace the chain of events and find its origin clearly, but on the day it happened, it arrived with the sudden violence of all well-planned things. Yuna had spent 4 days gathering her information, arranging her pieces, and selecting her moment with the precision of a woman who had learned from the most strategically ruthless man she knew. On the 5th morning, she called a meeting. Not with Jae-sung, with his mother. Mrs. Kwon Suja, 71 years old, the matriarch behind the Kwon syndicate's legitimate face, a woman who had once told her son that his Nigerian wife would never last and had spent 3 years believing she had been proven right. Yuna met her for lunch at a restaurant in Cheongdam-dong, discreet, expensive, favored by women who had things to discuss that weren't for general circulation. She laid out everything. The maid. The children. The triplets. The full names. The 3 years of silence. She watched Mrs. Kwon's face go through 4 distinct phases, disbelief, calculation, fury, and resolution, in the space of 4 minutes. Then she sat back and folded her hands and said, with perfect calm, "I thought you should know." She didn't say what she expected the old woman to do with the information. She didn't need to. Mrs. Kwon had spent 50 years knowing exactly what to do with information. Mrs. Kwon arrived at the villa that same afternoon without announcement, which was a habit she shared with her son and which was, Jae-sung would later observe, the only thing about them that was truly alike. She came with 2 of her personal assistants and the particular energy of a woman who has decided something. Jae-sung was in the study when he heard his mother's voice in the foyer, a voice that had always contained within it the full history of everything she expected from everyone, and went cold. He moved through the villa toward the sound, and found his mother already in the east corridor, already pointed in the direction of the servants' quarters, already striding with purpose. He stepped in front of her. "Iyama." She stopped. Looked at him. Her eyes, sharp, black, calculating, moved over his face with the exhaustive efficiency of someone reading a report they had already expected to be bad. "You have 3 children in this house," she said. Not a question. A verdict. Behind her, Yuna stood in the corridor entrance looking at a point above everyone's heads, performing innocence, and performing it badly, because Jae-sung now knew her well enough to read the satisfaction she was suppressing. He turned to Yuna slowly. She held his gaze for exactly 1 second and then looked away, which was its own confession. He had a choice to make. He could manage his mother, confront Yuna, protect Adaeze, but he could not do all 3 simultaneously, and all 3 needed doing simultaneously, and the particular cruelty of the moment was that the person he needed most to consult was the one he had lost the right to consult 3 years ago. He made his decision in the space of a breath. He looked at his mother and said, in Korean, quiet and complete, "Those are my children. You will not go near them without my permission. Not today. Not ever. Are we clear?" The corridor went absolutely silent. Mrs. Kwon stared at her son. In 50 years, he had deferred to her on most things. On business. On strategy. On marriage, until Lagos. She saw something in his face now that she recognized because she had worn it herself, once, long ago, the particular expression of a person who has located the thing they will not compromise on, and is done negotiating. She said nothing. She turned and walked back toward the foyer with her assistants trailing behind her. At the door, without turning around, she said, "This isn't finished, Jae-sung." He said, "I know." She left. He turned. Yuna was still in the corridor entrance, still performing. He looked at her for a long moment. "Pack my things," he said. "I won't be sleeping here tonight." He found Adaeze in the servant's kitchen, and he could tell from the set of her shoulders that she had heard. The villa's walls were thin and his mother's voice was not. She was washing dishes with controlled, precise movements, the same way she had carried that persimmon tray the first night, like controlled movement was the only armor available. He came in and sat at the small table without asking permission. She didn't tell him to leave. That felt like its own kind of progress. He told her what had happened. All of it, Yuna's call to his mother's arrival, what he had said in the corridor. He watched her process it. She didn't soften, not immediately, but something in her posture shifted, the angle of her defenses, not coming down but turning, reorienting toward a different threat. "Your mother will not stop," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," he agreed. "She won't." Adaeze turned off the tap. Dried her hands on a cloth. Turned to face him. And for the first time since the persimmon tray, she looked at him not as a crisis to be managed but as something more complicated. A person. A problem and a resource simultaneously. He could see her calculating. He waited. He had learned, finally, that the most important thing he could offer her was that, stillness. The willingness to wait while she decided. "They'll need to be moved," she said finally. "Somewhere Mrs. Kwon's people don't know." He nodded. "I know a place." She looked at him. "Not one of your places," she said. "Somewhere clean." He thought about it. Thought about who he trusted. The list, when held up against the requirements, safe, clean, no syndicate ties, was shorter than he expected. "I have a property in Gyeonggi-do. Off the books. My sister's name." Adaeze looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "The children will want to bring their books." He felt something release in his chest, not resolved, not healed, nothing like that, but open. A door, not yet walked through. "Tell me what they need," he said. "I'll get it." That night, while the villa slept and Yuna sat in her beautiful room making phone calls she believed were private, Adaeze packed 3 small bags with the efficiency of a woman who had been, in some corner of her mind, always prepared for this moment. Zara woke up and watched silently, with her arms crossed, and when Adaeze said they were going on a trip, Zara nodded like this was information she had already received from some other source. Kemi slept through the entire packing. Taeyong woke briefly, saw his mother's face, and went back to sleep, secure in the logic that wherever she was, there was safety. Jae-sung carried the bags. He did it without being asked. It was the first time in 3 years he had been useful to her in a way that required nothing in return, and he understood, somewhere beyond strategy, that this was where it started. Not grand gestures. Not restitution. Just, carrying the bags. Just being present for the weight of things. Outside, the Seoul night was clear and cold, the Han River a black ribbon in the distance, the city brilliant and indifferent around them. 3 sleeping children, 2 complicated adults, and the beginning of something that had no clean name yet. Just motion. Just forward. The house in Gyeonggi-do was small and real, a 2-story place near Yangpyeong, surrounded by pine trees and a small stream that ran with a sound like continuous forgiveness. Jae-sung's sister, Hyejin, had bought it years ago as a retreat and rarely used it. It smelled of pine and old wood and the specific quiet of places that have not been asked to perform anything. Adaeze stood in the main room on the first morning and breathed. The triplets were already in the garden. Kemi had found a grasshopper within 40 seconds of arriving. Zara was inspecting the stream with engineering focus. Taeyong was sitting in a patch of morning sun with his face tilted up, absorbing it. Adaeze watched them through the window and felt the particular exhaustion of sustained vigilance beginning, slowly, to release. She had been holding herself tight for 3 years, pulled together by necessity, by love, by the refusal to break in front of her children. Out here, in the pine-filtered morning light, she allowed herself to feel how tired she was. Not defeated. Tired. There was a difference, and knowing the difference was one of the things 3 years of surviving had taught her. Jae-sung stayed. He had told his lieutenants he was unavailable for the week, and for the first time in his professional life, he hadn't felt the compulsion to manage their reactions. He slept in the downstairs room. He did not push or press. He made coffee in the mornings and left a cup near where Adaeze was usually sitting when she came downstairs, and they had learned to share that early quiet without filling it with things that weren't ready to be said. He spent time with the triplets, careful, patient, learning their textures the way you learn a new language, slowly, making mistakes, trying again. Taeyong warmed to him fastest, which surprised Adaeze and seemed to surprise Jae-sung himself. The boys simply appeared at his elbow one morning while Jae-sung was fixing a stuck window latch, and stood there offering small observations about the process, and that was that. Kemi announced she had decided he was her friend, which Jae-sung accepted with more visible emotion than he managed to suppress. Zara took 4 days. But when she finally spoke to him directly, asking, in a combination of languages that required him to listen very carefully, whether he knew how to play yatunori, something in the household's geography permanently shifted. On the 5th evening, Adaeze told him the rest. The part she had left out in the terrace summary. What it had been like to land in Lagos alone and 8 months pregnant, her pride the only thing arriving intact. The night the triplets were born, a difficult delivery, too fast and then too slow, her father holding her hand and her mother praying in Igbo, and the moment she held all 3 of them, one at a time, and understood that she had crossed a threshold from which there was no looking back. The years of building, the remote work, the savings, the letters to Chief Obi's cardiologist in London, the careful calculus of every decision. She told him about the fear. Not of poverty, she had built enough to prevent that, but the specific fear that lives inside single parents who know that they are the only net beneath 3 falling children at all times. That fear does not sleep. It monitors. It watches the door. Jae-sung listened to all of it without looking away, without defending himself, without saying anything that wasn't necessary. At one point, quietly, he said, "I should have read the papers." She knew he meant more than the divorce documents. He meant all of it, the carelessness, the assumption that her departure was a door he could ignore because he hadn't been the one to walk through it. She said, "Yes. You should have." And they left it there, not as a wound but as a fact. Truth, when it's finally just allowed to sit still, stops needing to hurt. The question of what happened next required careful engineering, not because either of them was naive about the complications, but because both of them were clear-eyed enough to know that emotion without structure was a dream, and dreams were not something 3 3-year-olds could be raised inside. There were practical things. Jae-sung had an empire that was not, despite his intentions, going to quietly reorganize itself around family life. His mother was not resolved, she had gone quiet, which was more dangerous. Yuna had demonstrated her willingness to deploy information as a weapon, which meant she would need to be addressed in terms she understood, formal, final, and expensive. There were legal questions about the children, their documentation, their recognition, their place in a world that was going to require them to navigate 2 countries, 2 cultures, and the specific weight of who their father was. Adaeze laid all of this out at the kitchen table on the 6th morning with a notepad and a pen. Because she was not a woman who processed things in the air, she put them on paper where they could be looked at clearly. Jae-sung sat across from her and they went through it the way they used to go through things, back when they had been two people who were honest with each other, methodically, taking turns, no item left unaddressed. Jae-sung began restructuring. Not dramatically, not overnight, but in the way that real change actually happens, quietly, decision by decision, from the inside out. He appointed a deputy to handle operational management, a man he had trusted for 12 years who had no reason to misuse the position. He filed documentation through his private attorney to formally recognize the triplets, Zara, Kemi, and Taeyang, all three names, both heritages, full and official. He enrolled in nothing, promised nothing he couldn't deliver, made no grand romantic declarations. What he did was show up. Every day, in the small ways that children notice and adults tend to overlook, fixing the window latch, learning the grasshopper's name that Kemi had given it, sitting with Taeyang in the morning sun, losing 3 consecutive games of yet Nori to Zara because she played with an intensity that brooked no mercy. And slowly, over days that accumulated without announcement, Adaeze began to let him in, not back to where he had been, because that place no longer existed, but into the new architecture. The one she had built alone. The one that now had room, carefully, for someone who had learned, late, imperfectly, but actually, how to deserve it. On the last evening before life would ask them to return to its complications, they sat on the small wooden porch with the stream running in the dark below. The children were asleep. The pine trees stood quiet. Adaeze had a cup of tea. He had nothing. They sat in the kind of silence that two people share when they have stopped needing to perform anything for each other. He reached across the space between their chairs and put his hand, palm up, on the armrest between them. Not grabbing. Not claiming. Just, there. Available. She looked at it for a long time. The stream kept running. Somewhere in the trees, something small and alive moved in the dark. Then she put her hand in his. Not a promise. Not forgiveness, not yet. But the beginning of both, which, in the end, is where everything real starts. Not with the grand moment. With the small, deliberate, chosen one. The end. If this story moved you, drop a comment with your country and your favorite character. Was it Adaeze's strength? Taeyang's quiet wisdom? Or the moment Jae-sung finally chose right? Share this with someone who needs to hear a story about love that survives its own worst mistakes.